Oh man, here they come again.
Here they come again. This still has skin on the skull.
I was being abducted from as early as I can remember. I don't remember a time in my life where they weren't coming for me. And even before I remember the actual abduction scenarios, I remember the Nordic entities. These are what people, yeah, the alien, for lack of a better word, non human entities that look somewhat human, but they are tall, generally very fair hair, fair skin. Their eyes are about twice the size of ours. And when I was little, I was terrified of my father's side of the family. They were tall, blonde, fair haired, fair eyed, thin, because they reminded me of these Nordic entities. And this is, we're talking a 2 or 3 year old. So at that point, I was already very afraid of anything that reminded me of these entities, even though I wasn't remembering the actual being taken scenario. When I started remembering being taken was about probably 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And I just, they would come for me at night, and I always was looking for somewhere to hide, just some way to get away from them, for them not to find me, but they always found me. Um, Typically, it would be I would wake up and I could just feel something in the room change. I felt evil presence in the room, palpable. Just um, sometimes, if I were in the country, like all the cicadas, if the window was open and the screen was in it, all the cicadas and crickets would get silent. Sometimes the cows in the barn would go crazy, or sometimes they would just get silent. Um, Sometimes there'd be a very bright light, but not every time. I don't remember that every time. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. I just don't remember it every time. Um, and then there would be two at least of these shorter gray, typical gray type alien entities, somewhere in the room. Sometimes back in a corner, sometimes at the foot of the bed, sometimes beside the bed. Typical bulbous head, black screen eyes, um, very frail looking, um, very cold and emotionless entities. And as soon as I would notice them, the terror would just take over. And sometimes I would wet the bed as a little kid as soon as they showed up. And they would do this thing where I couldn't move, where I'd be paralyzed, like sleep paralysis that my friend Vicky we were talking about. She's kind of an expert in that. But from that point, I would be levitated off the bed and get up to the ceiling or out a window, and a closed window. And, getting levitated up to the ceiling, I remember seeing every little detail, like the little curls in the wallpaper, because my grandma's ceiling was wallpapered. And at the very edges, it was just a little bit brown and a little bit curled. And, I always wondered why that happened, and when things are like that are happening, your brain just takes you everywhere else it can go. So how many flies are in that light fixture that's hanging down? Or, I'm right up to the screen and I can see every little square in the screen, which ones are bent, which ones are broken. None of them are straight, which is funny. Um, and as I would get up to the screen or to the window or the ceiling, my body would just get this feeling over my whole body where it was almost like a vibration. It's hard to describe because I don't have anything here that does this, but it almost felt like my body went into a bazillion little pieces, almost like ball bearings. And I would be going through a solid object like a window or a ceiling, and watching everything get further and further away. At that point, most of the time I would be put into a sleep state once they got me out. Um, Sometimes before that point as well, sometimes right away, especially if I was getting upset, they had this ability to just turn me off into sleep state. And I would wake up different places. Sometimes I would wake up on an exam table and they would be doing different examination type things. And they never said what it was. Sometimes it was like big machinery type things that looked like maybe when, you get an x-ray machine pulled over, if you've ever had that, or I don't know what these machines did. There were needles that would go into my neck or my chest or different parts of my body. And sometimes they take blood and skin samples and it counting my, vertebrae or something, touching on my back. It's just weird things. No one ever said what it was. So it was always just random things. And sometimes I would wake up, and often I would wake up in this, getting onto these elevators. They had these big, I don't know how we got to that point, but we'd get on these big elevators that went down and down and down. And then I would get on what, when I was little, I called the sideways elevators, because everything to me that moved like a vehicle made noise back in the 60s and 70s. Cars weren't quiet. We didn't have electric cars or anything. We didn't have high speed rail. So I just felt like it was another elevator. It only had benches. So it had these bench seats I'd sit on, and it was really cold. I remember that. It was so cold. I used to go to sleep holding my blanket really tight, because I thought, if they take me, if I can keep this blanket with me, I won't be as cold, because I was always cold where they took me. It's terrible. Anyway, this is one of those weird details. And then that train would take me, or whatever it was, that vehicle would get off, and then it would be into one room or another, sometimes into one room where there'd be other little kids, lots of little kids. They had these big round tables in this one room. It was like a big room, like an oblong, long room. And one side of it had a really big, like, window, which I'm assuming was some kind of observation window. Maybe they were watching us. I don't know. Again, no one tells you anything. You're just there. You're like a lab rat getting thrown into whatever box they want you in that day. So, and sometimes I would be in a waiting room, or sometimes I would just be kind of walking around with this guy that I called my handler. I refer to him as my handler in the book. There's this guy that was with me from the beginning, practically. I don't remember a time when he wasn't around. He appeared as a man. He usually wore sort of military-looking fatigues, boots with the pants tucked in kind of thing. I just always remember looking at that, because I was little. So, and he was really tall. Just buzz cut hair, square jawed, very military-ish looking, just like he could have been cut out of a magazine. And he was with me my whole life. And he walked, when I would go there later in life, when I would be dropped off into this kind of, there's this really big area, and it's underground, but it's the size, it's bigger than like than a football stadium or an airport and all that. It's just massive. And there's lots of people being dropped off into this area, and everyone's kind of going in different directions to different places, or being led to different places. I didn't pay too much attention, because once I got there, I knew where he was. Like, this guy didn't have a name. He had an imprint. And I always knew where he was, and I knew who he was. And we had like this weird connection. Like, they didn't use names. So it's just really hard to describe. So when I would get there, I would just sense right where he was and just go straight to wherever he was. And then he would take me off to whatever we were doing that day. And, the evolution of it was, as a child, it was almost like being groomed to, for what to do and what was going to happen, and evolving. And I've talked to a lot of abductees who had this similar scenario where, from the time they were little, that's what happened. And they had a person too, or he wasn't really a person. So I call him a person because he appeared that way, but he wasn't really a person. But when I was little, I did try to talk about it. I tried to tell people. It's not like this was just happening and I'm like, oh, this is just fine. I'm a kid and I'm going to put up with this. I was not putting up with it. And when these abductions were over, they would bring me back, and I wouldn't usually remember being brought back. But I would wake up after being brought back, usually right after sometimes, and I would go and sleep under my parents' bed or at the foot of their bed to try to hide. so they wouldn't come back. Sometimes I wake up without my pajamas. Sometimes my pajamas would be in another room. Sometimes I would be in another room. Sometimes they'd be on inside out. Weird things that just didn't make sense. My parents couldn't understand what was going on or why I was sleeping under their bed every other night. And I tried to tell, but I didn't have the vocabulary to explain to people who these things were and what they were doing. And I wasn't even sure what they were doing, right? So we didn't have the movies and books and podcasts and TV shows. Today you can't flip a channel without seeing a UFO show. But it wasn't that way back then, in the 60s. It really wasn't. It was really the stuff of outside, fringy kind of, I don't even know where you would find it back then, quite honestly. I'm sure it was out there. I just don't know where. So I tried to talk about it. And as I was trying to talk about it and nobody understood what I was talking about, they realized I was trying to talk about it. And so one night when they came to take me, they took me into the backyard of my grandparents' farm. And I was outside and, the grass was wet from the dew. I felt everything of being outside, but they showed me like a screen memory in front of me. And it would be like wearing VR goggles would be today. But I also, back then, we didn't have anything like that. So there was no way to explain or describe it until recently. And they showed me my parents and all of my family, grandparents, parents, siblings, being walked out in front of me. There was a clothesline going across the yard, and they all were walked out to the other side of that clothesline. And I was on one side, they were on the other. And they sprayed something on their necks, on the backs and the fronts of their necks. And they said, if you continue to try to talk to people about this, this is what's going to happen. And they beheaded my family in front of me as a little kid. And then they ended it. And then I realized it wasn't real. But, that little, I didn't know where to put that. That just, it kind of, that's, I think, a point where I kind of started to lose it. So then after that, shortly after that, they had to call my mom to the school because they just found me curled up in the corner of a bathroom stall, just rocking. And I kept saying, they need to leave me alone. They need to stop touching me. They need to leave me alone. They need to stop taking me. They didn't know what I was talking about. They thought maybe it was other kids at school were bothering me. So she took me to the doctors to see if I had been abused. There were marks and strange, I had a strange burn on my back and things like that he couldn't explain. But he said I was fine and whatever had happened to me, because it was clear that things were something had happened, I would forget because I was young. And that was the end of it. And at that point, I realized there's nothing I could do. I was trapped. And so I think at that point, as I made the choice to live this life and put that over here and kind of just compartmentalize and separate my life from that and disassociate with it as much as I could. And that's what I did from that point on. I just learned to dissociate from it. Night times are horrible for me. My whole life of nighttime has been the worst. Couldn't look out a window at night. Just couldn't be alone at night. Couldn't go out, look out a window. Couldn't do anything like that because it just is too terrifying. Too terrifying. Sorry. Okay, I've gone on for a while.
No, you're
sorry.
No, you're
questions.
You're absolutely fine. You're absolutely fine. And I want to kind of jump right back into this whole story with you.
Okay.
But since I'm talking, it's incredible hearing you say that because at the point of you having somebody tell you that this, whatever you're going through, you'll forget about, and you realizing nobody's coming to save you is the moment I imagine that on the other side, these beings were like, we got her. We have her, because she has now submitted herself to the idea that that this is just going to happen, and she has now accepted it. And so there's no more, there's nothing, there's no struggle now. And that's a pivotal moment, I imagine. That in the moment you didn't realize how pivotal it was.
Oh
But
no, yeah.
man, that's incredible. So at this point, you're going through this stuff. There's nobody to save you. There's nobody coming to save you. There's no help coming. What's the next step in this process then? At what point are they now turning this into, because I mean, they're doing this abduction stuff, which by the way, this is stuff that me and Joel and other people have been looking into for a while. And this is like, when you say you went through your window, but the window didn't open, that makes complete sense to me. Okay. I may not have the proper verbiage to describe it. I've never gone through it. And I'm definitely not the researcher guy that, is like, oh, let me tell you what this phenomenon is.
Yeah.
But the best I can say is, from my perspective of talking with people, at some point before you went through that window, there is a dimensional shift that's happening, and your physical body is no longer acting the way it's supposed to, because you're not totally in this realm anymore. And
Exactly.
so that's how you view it too?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Because you can feel the shift, and I think that's part of the reason they do the sleep paralysis, because it kind of gives them an opportunity to shift you into another dimensional. They can, these are beings who are so far advanced of us. They can manipulate space, time, energy, and matter in ways that we can't even conceive of yet. And the things they were doing then, some of them are catching up, like the virtual reality type things, like the ectogenesis, the artificial wombs. There are things that they did then that seemed so fantastical. Who would believe me? But now we have those things. The way they travel, the high-speed trains, the babies and the incubator type things. But so all of this, is it sounds so far out there, but there's too many of us who've experienced this exact same thing. I mean, I probably have at least one every day new person comes forward and says, I could have written that story. Thank you for writing that book. I know I'm not alone now. And that's why I did it. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want anyone to feel alone like I did for 50 years of my life. I just, you need to be able to know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. But yeah, I think that point, I was about 6 years old. That's the point where I chose self-preservation over fighting, because I didn't have the tools to fight them. And I didn't have anyone to show me what those tools would be if they existed. So I chose self-preservation over fighting. And, because it damages you mentally so badly that if you don't separate it, there's just, I think it makes sense why some people just go completely bonkers, completely crazy. A lot of people who go through this, they live on the streets. They can never hold down a job. They can never hold down a relationship. They can never live a normal life. And I get it. I understand why. It can really turn your life inside out. And I'm blessed that happened. I know that as a little kid, I knew about Jesus. I knew about God. We went to church, but we didn't learn any of this stuff. We learned some Bible stories, and we knew who Jesus was, and we knew about holidays, things that didn't really give me anything to work with. But there were some nights when I was little where I don't know why, but when I felt like I was at my end, I would sing the Jesus Loves Me song to myself. And I felt like, that must have helped, because somewhere along the way, God gave me that ability to continue on. And that was all God, because I was very weak. So anyway, but yeah, so it's definitely a dicey situation for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions before I go on?
Nope, go ahead. Continue.
Okay.
It's fine.
So after that, the relationship changed with my handler as I came into maturity, and it became a physical relationship. I got to the point where I was just so used to being taken. And the underground, these facilities, I know they were underground because we were going down in elevators. And there weren't, there was no windows to the outside or anything like that. We would walk around, and one of the things that struck me the most was that there were humans working alongside these different entities. And I was not allowed to talk to the other people who were there, and they were not allowed to talk to me. There were clearly abductees, and then there were clearly employees or workers there. Some of the humans had on like lab coats, like doctor coats type things, or scientist-y coats or whatever. And I didn't know what they did because I couldn't talk to them. Some looked like they were military, and some of them had these really benign kind of beige, kind of a gray beige smock type top and bottom, like skirt pants sets on that were really benign. And I don't know, some of them could have been non-human. I don't know. But I always, I often wondered why these people were there letting this happen. And then I found out the hard way. I write about it in the book. When I get to this part in the book, I tell people that, I warn people that if you're not comfortable with this type of thing, you might want to skip this part. So I will do this on a very high level with you. They utilized me and other people like me, which I watched, they would abuse us in front of the people working and utilize that to warn the people there that if you speak out about anything, if you don't obey the rules that have been, we've set down, you don't want this to happen to your wives, your daughters, your sisters, your friends, your family, your loved ones. And part of what we were used for was the propaganda to keep people quiet. I don't think the humans working there knew what they were getting into. And, if you think about it if you have a job and they're like, yeah, you're doing so great, we're going to put you on this next project. It's high security, top secret clearance, got to sign these NDAs. And then by the time you're there, you've already signed everything and signed off on everything. There's nothing you can do. And I understand these people protecting themselves and their families. I do. I don't like it, but I understand it. And as a parent, I'll do anything to protect my children. I get that. So, I had a lot of anger for a long time that no one protected me. But now I realize God protected me that whole time, because at any point in time I could have died. And I didn't. I'm still here. And then God gave me beauty for ashes. He gave me turned this around to use it for something good.